Hey, this is Kurt Papke from Visual Adventures, and today we're going to begin a trip that was 8 days in Woodland Caribou Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. This is true wilderness. As it turns out, we only saw a group of 3 canoes, 6 people, in 8 days, which is pretty remarkable and has been very different from our expeditions to the Boundary Waters in Minnesota. The Boundary Waters are getting very, very crowded, and gets hard to get a campsite. So this year we decided that we were going to go someplace to get away from it all, and boy did we. So here we go to Woodland Caribou in Ontario for 8 days of beautiful canoeing and fishing. Hope you enjoy the video.
Combining expert content on outdoor adventures with videography tips and tutorials. Visual Adventures with Kurt Papke. We were 4 people, median age about 70, 2 canoes, 3 food packs, and 4 backpacks or Duluth packs. We do not travel light. Our canoes are unique ballistic nylon skin-on-frame construction, as can be seen in the inset at lower right, and are made by Urban Boat Builders in St. Paul, Minnesota. These canoes weigh in at about 40 pounds each, making them easy to portage, but they are a bit on the fragile side, requiring special care at rocky portages to avoid serious damage. My trip began in Tucson, Arizona, where I live, and required a flight to Minnesota, where the rest of the group resides. From Minneapolis, we drove over 500 miles to the entry point, spending a night in Dryden. We crossed the border at International Falls and Fort Francis with passports in hand, and had our fresh eggs confiscated due to a bird flu outbreak in Canada. Fortunately, these were easy to replace at a grocery in Dryden. The final 70 kilometers was on a primitive road, but fortunately there have been a lot of improvements to it since our trip leader Bob drove down it a decade ago. If you look at YouTube videos on Woodland Caribou, it seems most folks do this as a fly-in. But we elected to drive to our entry point on Leano Lake. Our plan was to spend the first day and last night on a campsite on Leano and do all the portages and paddling to and from Elephant Head in one day. But we elected to move to Bunny Lake after 2 nights in search of better fishing. More on that later.
So this is the portage in. I just carried the 2 food bags up to the truck. 360 meters, not bad. It's about what? About 20 rods. And if you're used to measuring portages and rods. But, oh, here comes Greg. Getting out of his way. Last portage.
Last bit.
This one's a little in better condition than most of them that we used. Obviously, since it's an entry point, everybody that goes in or out, regardless of their route, is going to take this. But it's mostly uphill. Not surprisingly, the parking lot is up high on a hill. The road in follows kind of high ground around all these lakes and rivers, creeks. But so this one is a little bit unusual in that you're gaining so much elevation between the water and the other end of the portage. And like I say, it's a little bit better maintained. Some corduroy logs along the way here to keep you from getting too engulfed in the mud when it's raining out. But yeah, there's another sign that it's a entry point. A little signage here: no shooting, no ATVs. This is a wilderness. So, hey Bob, how you doing? We're getting close to the lake end of the portage, so I thought I'd start up the camera again. I don't know what all these little red berries look very familiar to me. Like I used to see them in Minnesota, and I used to know what they were, but I've forgotten now. It's been 14 years since I moved from Minnesota to Tucson, 14 years. So you kind of start to forget some of the factoids about the area. But, just coming up on the portage here, and no more canoes. Both the canoes have been carried up, and just gear packs I need to go up. And here's our last look at Leano Lake. The reedy looking stuff here is wild rice. And interestingly enough, there's still a little bit of rice on there. So kind of late in the season, but it's probably all dried up. Probably isn't any good anymore, but it is wild rice. So Leano Lake portage, entry point. Here we go.
The first thing we look for when selecting a campsite is a level spot to land the canoes, as we can't run ours up onto the rocks like you can with a Kevlar craft. The glaciers carved a nice ramp in these rocks to land and store our canoes. The central area is the stone fire ring and cooking and eating area. This campsite had an especially large flat rock on the back side of the fireplace. Yes, we do bring lightweight chairs on our canoe trips. They feel mighty good after sitting upright in a canoe all day. Let's head back to my campsite. In this site, I had a nice little nook carved into the woods with sturdy trees for my hammock. Bob was in the blue tent next door, and Mark was in his Hennessy hammock down by the water's edge. Most of the campsites have only a couple of tent pads, so our mix of 2 hammocks and 2 tents works out pretty well, and becomes even more important when we have 3 canoes for 5 or 6 guys. Greg is in another tent behind the cooking area. This site had a beautiful trail that followed the water's edge to a point on the island. This was a handy latrine area and had some nice shoreline for bathing. At the very end of the trail was a point with a 270-degree view, which is where I filmed the intro and outro to this video. What a great spot.
Coming into a portage here. You can see they're not very easy to see. There's no signage. All you can see is that there's a kind of an open area, some rocks. There are actually some blazes on the trees where they've stripped off the bark with a knife or something, and that's the official marking for the portage. Just coming off a 80-meter portage. Got about a mile. And then our next portage is a real shorty, like 50 meters. Just getting ready to launch here. These landings are always an interesting situation with the rocks and the mud and drop-offs and getting in and getting out. And
so as you can see, we get wet up to our knees pretty much all day long. And there's always a quandary what kind of footwear is best. Most of us have settled on some kind of running shoes or boat shoes, something like that, that you can portage with, but yet don't keep your feet too wet. Waterproof boots just won't work at all. They'll just hold in the water. I generally wear a pair of my Ultra trail running shoes, and those seem to work pretty well for me, and then bring camp shoes as well. Some kind of flip-flops or something.
all right, everybody's in except for me. So one of the hazards up here are beaver dams. We're just coming up on one. Someone or something broke the middle of it here. So it's still high enough that, whoops, rock. Shit, sorry. Wasn't looking where we were going. So we're gonna have to unload, or not, I don't think we'll have to unload at this one, but we'll have to get out of the canoe and carry it across that little indentation there.
More? You can. Yeah. I think I can get out now.
A little deep on that far side, isn't it?
Yeah.
It took us a couple of hours to paddle and portage to Elephant Head, where paddle planners said there was a 4-star campsite. It was okay, but low to the water so the views weren't great. But the sphagnum moss made for great sleeping for the guys on the ground in tents. We fished in the surrounding lakes all of the next day and caught some small northerns. We had intended to stay most of the week here, but that night we decided to pack up the next day and paddle back to Bunny Lake, which looked to have deeper water for better fishing. Our campsite on Bunny Lake has to be one of my all-time favorites. For starters, it comprises an entire island in the middle of the lake. It rises high above the water on solid granite, but the sides are not so steep to make it difficult to traverse. Let's take a little tour of this stunning campsite, recorded at about 7 a.m. before anyone else got up. We'll begin with the view from the southern tip of the island, looking back at my hammock campsite. It was a glorious morning, with just a hint of mist over the water. The water in Bunny Lake was very clear, with less tannins than we saw in some of the other lakes. Let's take a stroll past our canoes, tipped safely upside down so as not to accumulate puddles in case of rain, and to make it harder for the wind to catch them. My campsite was on a small peninsula, with water to the left and right of my hammock. The tree on the head end was substantial, but bent quite a bit when my full 220 pounds was weighing down my hammock. I was a little worried that the tree roots would let go due to the thin soil, so I tied some rope between my anchor tree and a larger specimen that hopefully would prevent a tree falling on my head in the middle of the night. I'm not sure it helped, but it made me feel better. This is the latrine area. The lack of soil made it hard to dig a hole, so we made use of rocks as best we could. The big boulder gave some sense of privacy. As we continue up the hill, we pass Bob's tent. The large boulder gave him a bit of shelter from the wind. There was a bit of a hill climb to the central area, but not so steep I couldn't make the trip in my flip-flops. This was our food storage and prep area. We share all meals and use these large blue bear-proof barrels for food storage and carry them in Army surplus packs that act as backpacks. They are a little uncomfortable on long portages, especially when filled at the beginning of the week, but by the last day they feel really light. On to our campfire area and firewood prep spot. Mark and Greg camped on top of the mound on the west end of the island. They had some great views. Greg's tent was in a little hole carved out of the rocks, which provided great wind protection, but it did have a bit of a slant to the floor. As I mentioned before, there was precious little soil on the island, and the tree roots seemed to let go before the trees grew too big and mature, so there was not a lot of good firewood available on the island. Greg, our fire guy, paddled a canoe to shore and selected a good-sized dead tree and towed it back to the island. Mark carried the tree up from the landing to our firewood prep area. Greg is quite a craftsman. He made the saw he is using from scrap wood. It comes apart and folds up into a small package that stows nicely in a pack. The saw blade is incredibly sharp and cuts through pine without much trouble. We also had brought an axe, mostly for splitting wood, but Greg and I each took a turn chopping logs with it. It takes about the same amount of time as the saw, but it uses different muscles and is a nice change of pace. Of course, the thicker logs burned better when split, so the axe did actually get used for its intended purpose. The end result was a nice pile of firewood, and the fire at night with the view of the setting sun was about as good as it gets. Except, of course, for the chocolate-stuffed marshmallows that Bob packed. They made for quite a dessert. These guys are Scotch drinkers, and each of us brought a liter or more of a libation to share during happy hour, which we held religiously every evening. While watching the fire one night, we were treated to a nice display of northern lights. Our campsite high on the island provided perfect viewing of nature's beautiful display. One of our main objectives on these canoe trips is, of course, to catch fish. We did catch some smallish northerns, which we only kept when we had other fish to make it worthwhile cleaning and cooking them.
Kurt's fry pan.
Yeah. Hey, looks nice.
Holy cow.
He's fighting all the way.
Here he's coming. He's a walleye. Walleye?
Woo! That's a whale.
Wow. Felt like yesterday. Beauty.
The real treat on this trip was the lake trout, and we landed several. We really weren't expecting these, as the lakes were not all that deep and the water was quite warm. Nonetheless, that pink flesh is pretty tasty. If you look closely, you can see some eggs on the cutting board. Must have been spawning season. We use mostly white gas stoves for cooking, but as you can see from the video, I also bring my jet boil. mostly for making French press coffee in the mornings. For this epic meal, we had both northern and lake trout, so I made fish curry from the northern and pan-fried the trout. The curry was pretty wonderful, served over Idahoan mashed potatoes. After dinner, there's always dishes to be cleaned. We heat water over a white gas stove and use a few drops of camp suds. The ground tarp is useful for keeping dirt off the dishes, and the overhead tarp is invaluable on rainy days, of which we had none on this trip. Besides fish, we saw plenty of evidence of beaver activity, but we never saw any beaver. They seemed to chew the bark on the trees, though we didn't know if they were eating the rosin or the bark. Since there are very few deciduous trees in the area, they don't have their usual food source. We saw and heard a flock of sandhill cranes fly over, but I didn't get my camera out in time to get any video. But we heard these Canadian geese coming from a long ways away, so I was able to get them flying directly overhead. Well, there's something about the quiet and solitude of these north woods and lakes that truly refreshes the soul. I really needed this trip after too much COVID, and I got more than I bargained for. Perfect weather, almost no other people, lots of fish, great campsites. What's not to like? My favorite part is always the hour or so in the morning when I make my first cup of coffee before anyone else is up, and I just sit there and watch the sunrise. It's these moments that stick with me the longest. I can't truly say the weather was perfect. We did have just enough rain to chase me under my tarp for a few minutes, but you won't hear me complaining. Finally, it was time to pack up. Take down the shelters, stuff the quilts into dry bags, pack the leftover food back into the barrels. Then it was time to load up the canoes one last time, wade into the now cooling water, hop into the canoes, and push off.
How's the water feel this morning, Greg?
One last short paddle back to the Leano Lake entry point. We only saw one other party of 3 canoes the whole time we were in the park, and they paddled just past our campsite as we were packing up. And they were gone by the time we got to the entry point, so we never had a chance to chat with them. Time for one last group selfie before we climbed into the truck. We looked a lot scruffier than in the group photo at the start, that's for sure.
Well, it's time to say goodbye to Woodland Caribou Provincial Park in Ontario. It's only fitting we're going to paddle out in just a few minutes here, that on our last day the weather was just absolutely perfect. Couldn't really ask for a better day. We've had 8 straight days like this. That's highly unusual. If you're going to come up here, make sure you're prepared for cold and rain. However, we really got super lucky on this trip. And as Greg said aptly last night, we've had a lack of adversity, which has been kind of refreshing. No major incidents, no weather problems. But if you're looking for true wilderness, this is the place to find it. Woodland Caribou Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. Take care, and if you enjoyed this video, please click like or subscribe down below, or leave me a comment or two. I love getting comments from viewers, and I always try to respond as best I can. Take care and be safe.